When the stresses of modern living get to be just too much, it's fun to think of what other time periods in history would be more fun to live in. And the Old West is a contender. The simplicity of life on the frontier, with a horse as a constant and faithful companion. Sleeping under the stars, cooking over a campfire, and sidling into town to refresh supplies. Maybe setting up a general store or a saloon. Sounds pretty great, right? However, a recent study indicates that while the West was perilous, it was not all gunfire and turmoil. The reality was far more complex than the films depicted. Countless numbers of people died prematurely during the years of our country's westward expansion, due to a wide variety of reasons. There were many dangers they faced every day through the course of living life and doing business. This is not to say that the West would have been a fantastic place to live. As a matter of fact, before anyone could survive in the American West, they had to face the risky journey to get there. And there was a pretty good chance of dying along the way. Stay tuned as we show you 10 awful ways people met their end in the Old West. There indeed were a million ways to die in the Wild West. Britannica estimates that between the 1840s and 1860s alone, there were between 300,000 to 400,000 people who headed west just on the Oregon Trail. Of those, the National Park Service says none in 10 died before they reached the Promised Land. There were a shocking number of ways people died without delay. Let's get into each of them. Number 10. Disease. When Dr. Jim Cornbert put the spotlight on the fastest killer in the Old West for True West magazine, it wasn't a bullet, it was cholera. A bullet, after all, can only kill a very limited number of people, but cholera is the gift that keeps on giving. In 1873 alone, a major cholera epidemic swept through the West, and at this point in history, the medical community understood exactly how it was spread. The bodily fluids expelled were called cholera poison. In Dr. John M. Woodworth's 1,044-page report to Congress, he concluded that disinfecting everything that could be disinfected was the way to go. Unfortunately, disinfectant was hard to come by in the West, and people kept dying. And that's just one disease. According to the National Park Service, illnesses such as measles, scurvy, dysentery, pneumonia, and smallpox were prevalent among the travelers. History indicates that smallpox was introduced to the Americas by the Spanish. Once it arrived, along with other European diseases, it resulted in the death of approximately 90% of the indigenous populations in North and South America. Those people were driven to horrifying extremes, like an incident recounted by historian David Derry via the New York Times. He found a newspaper account from 1878 of an Apache medicine man who, after diagnosing 2 babies with smallpox, placed them back to back, and with a single bullet killed both of them. 9. Cures historian David Derry wrote Frontier Medicine, a book that gave a disturbing look into what being a doctor in the Old West meant for doctors and their patients. It's grim stuff, says the New York Times, and he found that doctors were largely making things up as they went, prescribed cures that did more damage than the illness or injury. And tragically, white doctors scoffed at a treasure trove of information that could have done some real good. The medicinal knowledge of Native American tribes. There were essentially 3 options for anyone who was sick or injured, and that involved waiting for a doctor, if one could be found, treating their own problems, or just giving up the ghost. If the doctor showed up, he might perform a bloodletting, and apparently swallowing leeches was a common problem, or administer a weird medicine like the 1815 cure for arthritis and gout. That involved killing a dog, filling the body with things like turpentine, brimstone, and nettles, then roasting it over an open fire, breathe in the fumes, and be cured. It's no wonder many turned to self-medicating for chronic conditions. One of those people was Doc Holliday, Forrest Tennant, MD, says, via practical pain management, that he self-medicated with opium and alcohol when he developed tuberculosis. And while he lived longer than expected, he was also regularly coughing up chunks of his lungs. 8. Murders. Simply watch any Hollywood Western, and you'll soon realize that casualties were frequent. Nothing was sacred, and safety was a luxury. But is that accurate? Not really, says Montana State University Professor Emeritus of Economics Terry Anderson. He told Live Science that in spite of the popular depiction of the West as a place where everyone settled disputes with bullets, oftentimes things were much more civil. But they weren't exactly peaceful either. The Ohio State University's Criminal Justice Research Center did a deep dive into homicide rates in the Old West and found some surprising stuff. Let's take Dodge City during the boom years. Between 1876 and 1885, residents had a 1 in 61 chance of dying a violent death. Their homicide rate was around 165 per 100,000. And while that doesn't sound like much at all, let's put it in perspective. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say that in 2020, the homicide rate was about 7.8 per 100,000, and that it was a huge jump from previous years. Ohio State puts the chances of being murdered in Dodge City on the higher end, and even the low end of the scale is comparatively high to today's number. They say that Oregon had the lowest homicide rate at about 30 per 100,000. And the bottom line? Being murdered was a very real and constant fear. 7. Cocktail. It's no secret that some days the residents of the West only survived by being able to kick back with a cocktail. But in the Old West, even those cocktails could have been deadly. While most Westerns, cowboys and outlaws alike, might show sidling up to the bar and ordering a whiskey from the town's saloon, the Tahoe Daily Tribune found that in addition to locally brewed beers and plain old whiskey, saloons were much more likely to be serving up drinks like the possibly deadly tarantula juice. Drinking it was something that they say often resulted in violence because it contained the deadly and hallucinogenic strychnine. The drink got that inducing name because those who frequently partook in it complained of the feeling they were covered in crawling spiders. The CDC says that only small amounts of strychnine can cause strychnine poisoning and death. So that's fun. It also wasn't the only questionable substance in alcohol either. In many saloons, it was all about stretching liquor as far as they could and raising profits. Legans of America says that meant many saloons were cutting their liquors and serving customers a potentially deadly mix of booze with gunpowder, turpentine, and even ammonia. Number 6. Stees. In the Old West, cold nights were plentiful, and companionship often meant seeking solace in the arms of the women known as painted ladies and soiled doves. In other words, the era's sex workers. Unfortunately, this whole industry was set up in such a way that it almost guaranteed a shortened life for both the women and their clients. Christopher Knowlton wrote Cattle Kingdom, The Hidden History of the Cowboy West, and in it he took a look at the sex work industry. Once women got into the industry, there was little to no chance of getting out. Most died young of conditions made worse by things like disease, addiction, and poverty. And as historian Michael Rutter put it, this line of work never had a good retirement plan. According to Medicine in the Old West, some estimates suggest that about 50% of the West's sex workers had some form of venereal disease, which was spread to clients. They did take precautions, but it's easy to see how repeatedly using solutions containing chemicals like mercury, carbolic acid, mercuric cyanide, and boric acid might be more than a little dangerous. It's unclear how many people with venereal disease were killed, because the cause of death was often listed on death certificates as something other than venereal disease. Often, it was called cancer of the brain because of the decay that late-stage syphilis caused. Number 5. Native Americans to talk about the likelihood of dying in the Old West. It's absolutely necessary to talk about the people who did the most of it. Those were, of course, the Native Americans who had been living on the land for generations long before the Spanish landed, and said, "This looks great. We'll take it." Numbers are hard to come by, but history says that it's estimated North America was home to somewhere between 5 and 15 million people when Christopher Columbus sailed up. By the end of the 19th century, there were less than 238,000 left. Just what happened is complicated to sum up, but there are some major causes of all those deaths. Smallpox was particularly devastating, with the history suggesting it was responsible for a massive death toll. A series of wars, including the Battle of Tippecanoe, the War of 1812, and the Seminole Wars, further decreased in numbers along with outright massacres like the Sand Creek Massacre. Then there were forced relocations like the Trail of Tears that killed thousands of Native Americans in the 1830s, people who were forced off their ancestral homeland and forced to walk more than 1,000 miles to the land that the U.S. government decided they could live on. Bottom line, the Native Americans who survived the Old West were the exception, not the norm. 4. Mauled by bears, it's another serene evening in the Sierra Nevada as you watch the sun set into the granite realms surrounding your cabin's porch. The distant rumble of thunder seems out of place until you look to your left and see a massive black bear charging toward you with a thread of drool hanging from its mouth. You know fatal black bear attacks are extremely rare. They kill an average of 2 people per year, so you hesitate. But this is a lone male, hungry and suffering from food stress. He smells the trash outside your cabin, and now he's hunting you. You leap up and run inside to what you assume is the safety of the log cabin. A minute later, the animal smashes through the window. Prized are a determined scowl on its ugly mug. Banging pots and pans together to no avail, you retreat to the back room. Ordinarily the bear would flee, but today he follows. It hits you in the shoulder with a powerful shot, sending you to the floor. Holding you down with its paws, the Bruin begins scalping you with its front teeth. You hear it chipping away at your skull as pain sets your nerves on fire. In a desperate attempt to fight the animal off, you roll over onto your back, exposing your throat. The bear bites down. The next day, wildlife authorities shoot the animal as it attempts to break into another house. They find human remains in its stomach. Fatal black bear attacks are incredibly rare, but they do happen. A 2011 study found that male bears commit 92% of the attacks and are often influenced by a lack of food and the availability of human food or garbage. Number 3. Bee stings. It starts as an indistinct hum. You reach for the next hold, ignoring the buzzing in your ears when you feel a pinprick on your right thumb. Confused and alarmed, you look up to see a beehive. The first few pinpricks don't really endanger you. You're not allergic, you think, but they've sealed your fate. Each sting is accompanied by an alarm pheromone that smells vaguely like bananas and sends the hive of bees into a defensive frenzy. The bees begin to pour out of the hive. They sting every inch of your body, but seem particularly drawn to your head and neck areas of high vasculature. Fighting to swat them away, you swallow a fistful of the bees, which proceed to sting the inside of your throat. Your friend lowers you down safely, but you're covered in over 1,000 stings. The human lethal dose for honeybee stings is estimated to be between 500 to 1,200 stings if you receive medical. Off the cliff, you begin to vomit and suffer from diarrhea and incontinence. But your friends help you to the trailhead, where paramedics take you to the hospital. A day later, you're released from the hospital in good spirit. Unknowing to you or your inexperienced doctors, you'll be dead by the end of the week. Proteins in the venom dissolve blood cells and muscle tissue, releasing debris. As the debris accumulates, your kidneys become clogged, and you begin to experience renal failure. 2 days later, you're back in the hospital and die before doctors can begin dialysis. Number 2. Racism and xenophobia. The Library of Congress says that the gold rush brought with it a major influx of immigrants from China. To give an idea of numbers, 20,000 Chinese immigrated to California in 1852, and with them came some serious conflict made worse by the fact that violence was sort of government-sanctioned. Chinese miners were forced to pay $20 a month under a piece of legislation called the Foreign Miners License Law. And if that doesn't sound like much, let's add that's around $675 in today's money, all in order for them to be allowed to do their job. National Geographic says that from the moment they entered the country, Chinese immigrants were subjected to all kinds of abuses and assaults, with incidents like the deadly events of October 24th, 1871. That saw one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history, and it targeted LA's Chinese population. It was just one relatively small part of the 19th century's hatred of Chinese immigrants, and given that the Chinese, Native Americans, and black people were all banned from testifying in court against the white majority, it was an environment where violence went unpunished. Formally organized groups existed for no other purpose than spearheading assaults, arson, murders, and lynchings, and included the Ku Klux Klan. Life in the Old West could be deadly for anyone, and for anyone who was Chinese, death was around every corner. Number 1. Mining. Starting with the California gold rush of 1849, mining operations started popping up across the West. As they did, the Independence Hall Association in Philadelphia says that more and more precious metals were found, until miners weren't just looking for gold. They were also looking for fortunes in silver, copper, lead, and zinc, all of which were key components to the nation's rapidly advancing industries. Montana State University Professor Emeritus of History Pierce Mullen says it quickly became clear just how many ways there were to die in mining, from mine collapses and explosions to falling down ladders that stretched for hundreds of feet. Exhaustion played a huge part in the danger, and so did sanitation. Miners typically lived in closely packed communities that were breeding grounds for disease, and they were drinking water contaminated by both these not-so-sanitary living conditions, but also by runoff from the mines. True West magazine says that it was only at the beginning of the 20th century that the medical profession started to understand why so many miners were dying of lung-related disorders like tuberculosis. The start of the disease was in silicosis, which came from breathing silica-laden dust. If that didn't result in sudden and premature death, then there was a good chance something else, like carbon monoxide poisoning, the loss of a few fingers or limbs, infection, or exposure to mercury and arsenic would. The challenges we face now cannot compare to the suffering in the Wild West. At the time, many people lost lives beginning from when they were immigrating to the Old West. These listed ways of dying were just the big ones, and there were other risks too. Rattlesnake bites could turn deadly, and at the time, bison were still all over the place. A stampeding herd could quickly and easily overrun a wagon train, and they did. The animals traveling with a convoy were also a major danger. Most traveled with their own herds, which included oxen, horses, and mules, and riding accidents weren't the only risk. People were kicked and killed in stampedes, and perhaps the most tragic of these deaths were those who fell off wagons and were either crushed by wheels or other wagons, or dragged along behind. So, what do you think? Do you still picture yourself living in the days of the Wild West? Would you have survived in the Wild West, based on the tricky and dangerous circumstances? I bet many would have relished the opportunity to live during this era, but that's if you were the kind who would put up with the dangers that existed. And with that, we wrap up today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you will be the first to see our new updates. See you in our next video.